We're going to try to be very quiet on this episode of Datasheet Deep Dive to try to respect the traditions of its subject. And that's because we're talking about the Silent King. He's a super quiet guy. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time to do another Datasheet Deep Dive. This is the video series where we take one unit datasheet from Warhammer 40k and talk all about it, including, but not limited to, the stats, all the special abilities and weapons, what they all do, the best ways to build it into your list and use it on the table, and some synergies from the faction you can use alongside it to get the most out of that particular unit before we go to a final verdict at the end and ask the ultimate question. Should you put this unit in your list? And today we are talking about the Silent King, one of the few supreme commanders in 9th edition Warhammer 40k. This was a deep dive topic requested by a TacticalTortoise patron. If you want to request new topics and vote for topics on the Datasheet Deep Dive series, you can do so by joining over at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. Also, you get some other cool benefits. You get early access to videos. Some tiers get patron exclusive videos. I'd love to see you there. Anyway, let's stop talking about things that aren't the Silent King, and instead start talking about things that are the Silent King, like, for example, the Silent King. This unit is known by many names. Some people call him Szarekh, because that's the name of the actual Silent King model, but the unit itself is called the Silent King. This datasheet is probably one of the densest we're going to talk about in the Datasheet Deep Dive series for the foreseeable future. It's also one of the longest and most intricate in all of Warhammer 40,000. This dude has approximately 1.2 million individual abilities that you have to keep in mind. It is wild. The Silent King is a Lord of War for a Necron army. He comes in at a measly 450 points. That's it. What a steal. Can you imagine? And for those 450 points, you get three models. You get Szarekh himself, which is the big dude on the big chair, and his two big sideways surfboards, the Triarchal Menhirs. Now, to get through a little bit of nomenclature, for the future of this video, I'm going to be referring to the top profile of Szarekh himself as Szarekh. It essentially includes himself, the Necron dude on the chair, and the big chair, but then also there are additional weapon profiles that reflect his two attendant court members that are also up there, and I'm going to be referring to those separately. The Szarekh model is considered to have all three weapon profiles. He just makes variable numbers of attacks with them. But essentially, the Scythe of Dust guy and the Staff of Stars guy and they basically have their own profiles, even though it's all bundled in with Sarekh's. So how does this profile actually work? Like we said before, he's got three models of the unit. Szarekh himself, who includes essentially all three profiles for the Necron dudes on the big chair, and the two Menhirs. And the unit's profile, all told, is pretty beefy. It's not particularly fast. It is move 8, and it does fly, fortunately, so it's not particularly impeded by terrain, although the large base does make it a little bit awkward to move around big walls and things. It comes into the 2+ weapon skill, ballistic skill. The Menhirs have a 6+ weapon skill, but that doesn't matter so much. The 2+ ballistic skill across the board is super nice, though. Base strength of 5, toughness 7, which is fine, but not great. However, 16 wounds on Szarekh himself, and each of the Menhirs have 5. He does have a degrading profile. He drops 2 inches of movement and 2 attacks for every bracket that he loses. And they've all got a 3+ base armor save. Now, as we can see, there's also a bundle of weapon profiles in this data sheet. Each of the Menhirs has one of the coolest weapons in the game, an Annihilator Beam. It's a one-shot heavy weapon, 36 inches of range, for strength 12, AP -4 for, get ready for this, flat 6 damage. We're not rolling any D6s here. We're not rolling a D3 + 3. It just does 6 damage. What's cool about this, and one thing that we'll talk about momentarily when we get to synergies with the Necron faction, is that this becomes one of the most consistent ranged profiles in the entire game. Hitting on 2s, probably wounding on 2s or 3s, and you automatically deal 6 damage if they have a 3+ save and no invulnerable. They don't even get to take a save against that. I mean, both of these have a non-zero chance of just like killing a Leman Russ straight up in the shooting phase at 36 inches out. That gets backed up with some other ranged weapon profiles, which are pretty good. More anti-infantry, but they're nice to have. The Staff of Stars guy shoots 9 shots at kind of an old school heavy bolter profile. Strength 6, -2 AP for 1 damage. Nice to have, and Strength 6 is really nice, especially as we're looking at fighting a lot of Toughness 3 or Toughness 5 models right now. So getting that Strength 6 to win on 3s and 2s is, very nice. AP2 is also a really good AP value to be at, because if you're fighting against like 2+ armor save Storm Shield guys, AP2 is the perfect AP value to get, because they're just going to bump up against their 4+ invulnerable save, and you're not losing any efficiency off that AP. We also have 3 shots out of the Scepter of Eternal Glory, which is Strength 8, -3 AP for 2 damage. Not a high volume of attacks, but again, this is nice to have in addition. One thing that I will mention is that the Scepter and the Staff shooting attacks are both assault weapons, and while Szarekh doesn't usually like to advance, it does allow the unit to advance and still make ranged attacks in the shooting phase, although it won't be able to make the attacks with its with the main heroes. That said, the main heroes will be dead first, so there's a non-zero chance they go down to shooting before Szarekh gets too close, and then being able to advance and still contribute in the shooting phase is actually going to be pretty useful. In the fight phase, this guy becomes an absolute nightmare to resolve, because, like I mentioned before, there are 3 Necron dudes up on the chair, and each one of them essentially has their own melee profile. Szarekh himself, the actual Silent King guy, uses the attacks profile on the datasheet. So he starts with 6 attacks and drops down to 4 and 2 as he brackets. His weapon is the Scepter of Eternal Glory, which comes in at Strength 9, AP3 for flat 2 damage. That's a pretty decent melee profile. You're basically looking at a Power Fist equivalent, but that doesn't have -1 to hit. So pretty consistent, lots of attacks, okay damage, just fine. The Staff of Stars guy, who is a little bit better at shooting with the Assault 9 weapon, is a little bit worse in melee. He comes in at 3 attacks, Strength 5, AP2 for only 1 damage. He's overshadowed, however, by the Scythe of Dust, which comes out at Strength 8, AP4 for 3 damage and makes 4 attacks with that weapon. So all told, this model makes 12 attacks in the fight phase, distributed between this high strength 2 damage weapon, mid strength 3 damage weapon, and low strength 1 damage weapon. Meaning that this dude probably should kill, most large vehicles, tanks, or characters that he gets into, and has enough volume of attacks to clean through a reasonable number of infantry, especially multi-wound infantry. Like, he will dirt 5 to 10 Space Marines, no problem in the fight phase. This guy's gonna cleave right through those. So far, the picture of this unit is pretty cool, right? He's relatively slow, but has a powerful ranged output, and once you get close in, backs it up with some incredible melee output. So it operates in multiple phases, does a bunch of damage, but what else does Szarekh do for you? One thing that I'll mention right now, and a little bit of a spoiler alert for when we get to the Synergies section of this video, is that the Silent King's motto is mostly ask not what you can do for Szarekh, ask instead what Szarekh can do for you, because in addition to being an incredible source of damage for your army, he also has multiple force multiplication auras that are super important for the Necron faction. All told, Szarekh has 15 individual abilities before we get to including a warlord trait as well. 15! I don't know if there are any units in the game that have more than this, but I would be willing to bet that there aren't. I think this might be the most. Although I didn't check, so don't quote me on that. Down in the comments section. First off, he's got Living Metal, so he's going to heal a wound every turn at the start of your command phase. And in addition, like all Necron units, he has the Command Protocols ability. He himself is a Noble, which means he projects the Command Protocol auras. It is worth mentioning that only the Szarekh model itself has the character keyword, as well as the noble keyword, so you only measure those command protocol auras from Szarekh, not the main heroes. In terms of special abilities, he's got a bunch. First off, he can deny a psychic power every turn. He gets a free Deny the Witch test, which is great. One of the weaknesses of Necrons is that they tend to be very weak in the psychic phase. Szarekh doesn't do a ton to supplant that, but he helps a little bit. Having one deny means your opponent can't just like freely run their psychic combos off anywhere on the table. They do have to worry about Szarekh. He also has kind of a Judicia Foul Blightspawn style aura at the start of the fight phase. Thanks to his obeisance generators, you pick an enemy unit in engagement range and it cannot fight until all other units have done so. Now, there is an outstanding question whether or not that means that you can use the counter-attack stratagem to allow them to interrupt in the fight phase. Because it doesn't say that unit is not eligible to fight until all other eligible units have done so. The question is whether or not being able to fight removes you from eligibility. And then the follow-up question is that whether you use counterattack to choose that unit to fight, whether it is then able to, even though it has an ability affecting it that says it can't. I don't 100% know the answer to that. In my opinion, if you can't fight and something tells you to fight, you still don't fight. And as far as I know, that's still an ongoing debate, but I think that will need to be FAQ'd sometime in the not too distant future. But keep it in mind if you decide to play Szarekh in your Necron army, that may be an interaction that comes up. And make sure that if you're going to a tournament or something, you know how the TO is going to play that interaction. He's got a couple pretty good aura abilities as well. First off, all core units or Triarch Praetorians, which is important because Triarch Praetorians themselves do not have core, for some reason that no one knows, get full rerolls to hit with ranged attacks. This is phenomenal, given that a lot of the damage output of a Necron army is from those big warrior or immortal blobs that are marching up the table and putting out immense quantities of that strength 4 or strength 5 Gauss attack. Getting full rerolls to hit is awesome. This is also full rerolls on ranged attacks, not just attacks in your shooting phase, which means that you can reroll on Overwatch as well. If you've also used My Will Be Done on a unit, they hit on 2s, and because it is a full hit roll reroll, not a failed hit roll reroll, try saying that 10 times fast, you can, if you want to, reroll your successful hits to try to fish for specific results. If you're using the Gauss stratagem to get the automatic wounds, for example, or if you're firing Tesla, you can reroll to try to get more Tesla hits. I've seen this combo used a lot with Tomb Blades with a billion Tesla attacks to try to grab as many of those as possible, and I think that is potentially very powerful. In addition, in the fight phase, he gives the same units, Necron Core or Triarch Praetorians, rerolls to wound. Also awesome, although Necrons aren't particularly known for their fight phase damage output. And unfortunately, a lot of the most powerful melee units in the faction are not core keyworded, so they aren't affected by this aura. But it does mean that your opponent does have to worry about engaging like a big brick of warriors, because getting, 20 to 40 attacks, depending on what abilities you have active on them, with full rerolls to wound is pretty good, probably hitting on 2s if they've been selected with My Will Be Done in the previous command phase. That's not going to do a ton of damage, given that for the most part they're only strength 4 without a significant melee profile, but it will leave a mark with those full rerolls. In addition, he also has Relentless March, and importantly, none of these abilities are Dynasty keyworded. So they affect every core and Praetorian unit within 6, regardless of the Dynasty, which means even if you're not playing a Szarekh army, you can still slot Silent King in, and he can affect units with those abilities regardless. So he's affecting everything with Relentless March and those rerolls to hit in the shooting phase and wound in the fight phase. He also has My Will Be Done, which can target the same units, and again, is not restricted by Dynasty. In conjunction with that, he also has the Pharaon ability, so he can use My Will Be Done twice instead of just once. And he has some other sweet special abilities just for him. Thanks to Voice of the Triarch, at the start of a battle round, he can swap out the command protocol that you've picked for that battle round for any of the ones that you didn't pick before the game, which means that you can sort of hold the most important one in your hand, and then anytime you need it, oh man, I need to be able to fall back and shoot, for example, or I need the extra movement this turn, you can swap that out at the start of the battle round proactively instead of just hoping that you picked the right turn for it to be active. So he even helps your army in that way as well. There is an interesting rule specifically about the Triarchal Mainheers, which requires you to allocate wounds to them before you allocate them to Szarekh. and it specifies that if Szarekh ever dies for whatever reason, then the Menhirs are destroyed. I don't think currently there's a game situation, I mean, maybe there is, where this would happen, but if it does, I guess the Menhirs go with him. In addition, the Menhirs do not get lookout Surd, so that's nice to know. Rounding things out, if Szarekh is in your army, he has to be your warlord, but he gives you an additional 3 command points. One of the hallmarks of a Silent King list is having a ridiculous number of command points, because he also fits into a Supreme Command attachment, which can then refund one of your command points for a battalion or something. So not only are you not spending command points typically on detachments, but you also start 3 up, so you're starting at 15 before any pregame spends, which is incredible. He has a 4+ invulnerable save, and he also has essentially a special bracketing rule where one of his little court member buddies will die for every bracket that he loses. So in his mid bracket, he loses the Staff of Stars guy, the shooty guy, and he loses the shooty aura, and on his bottom bracket, the Scythe of Dust guy dies, and he loses the melee aura. Szarekh himself also degrades pretty significantly. He's only down to 2 attacks at that point on his bottom bracket. But one thing to keep in mind is that it is ridiculously hard to bracket this dude because you have to shoot through both of those Menhirs before Szarekh himself actually starts taking damage. The bracketed wounds do not count those Menhir wounds, and each Menhir has 5 wounds itself. So you have to get through 10 wounds at toughness 7 with a 4+ invulnerable before you even damage Szarekh. Then you have to deal another 8 to get him to his mid bracket. So you have to deal 18 wounds in order for these abilities to start kicking in. Usually, Silent King games are very binary. Either he is at full bracket for the entire game, or he's dead immediately. So it's very rare that you get him all the way through and just barely don't kill him and leave him on his bottom profile. You either attack him and kill him, or you just ignore him and hope he doesn't kill your whole army. Last, but certainly not least, he also explodes on a 4+, dealing d6 mortal wounds to everything within 2d6 inches. Pretty intense explosion, if I do say so myself. And you can make that automatically happen with a stratagem, as we'll talk about momentarily. Like we mentioned before, Szarekh has to be your warlord if he's included in the army, and his warlord trait gives you even further control over your command protocol selection for the game. You can pick 4 command protocols instead of 5, and you can double one of them up. So you can select 1 command protocol to assign to 2 battle rounds instead of 1. That also means that thanks to his Voice of the Triarch ability, you're going to have additional command protocol cards to choose from when it comes time to swap one of those in or out. So you have unparalleled control over your command protocols if Szarekh is in your list. Last but not least, he has a billion million keywords. He's a Supreme Commander, which is important because that allows him to go into a Supreme Command detachment. He's a vehicle. He flies. Both of those are excellent to have, especially since they combo with a couple of stratagems that we'll talk about momentarily. He's also a noble and a pharaon. However, importantly, he is, in addition, a dynastic agent, which is actually not that great. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So overall, what does Silent King do on the table, and what does he do for your army? So first off, Silent King is absolutely an enormous beatstick. He hits ridiculously hard in melee, and he shoots ridiculously hard. The downside is that he is not particularly fast. Move 8, no advance and charge, no buffs to charge. It's not that good. He's not a core unit, so he's not affected by his own Relentless March, so he's just stuck at moving 8 inches. Fortunately, he does fly, so being a vehicle isn't that big of a deal because he can fly over most terrain, which is fine, and the fact that the entire unit has pretty large bases and a big footprint on the table means it's kind of difficult to maneuver him, especially if your army is relatively compact. That said, if your army compacts around Szarekh, you get a ridiculous number of bonuses. You get those full rerolls to hit in the shooting phase and wound in the fight phase. You also get his ability to My Build Be Done twice on any other dynasty, and you get his Relentless March aura as well. So essentially, he acts as a super overlord. He gives you all of the abilities of having an overlord as well as this concentrated bubble of incredible buffs. Necrons are an army that very much like to create a web of synergies around their core units, especially big units of like Bricks of Warriors or Immortals. And Szarekh turns all of those synergies right up to 11. He makes those big brick units incredibly powerful and force multiplies them ridiculously well, in addition to backing them up. So if your opponent commits into your Necron army, something that a lot of times they don't have a great response to Necrons not being particularly strong in the fight phase, the Silent King will come to their rescue and he will sweep away an immense amount of enemy aggression with his really good melee profile and that important obeisance generator ability as well, to make it that so that even if your opponent has dangerous melee units, they're not going to be able to hit him before he gets a chance to kill them. One thing I should note as well about his auras is that unlike similar abilities like Chapter Master in Space Marines, he doesn't choose a unit to benefit from them. It's just a persistent aura off of Szarekh himself. So, as long as you can string like one warrior out of a brick of 20 back from each of your units, your entire army can benefit from these buffs. He can affect an enormous swath of the table with these full rerolls, much more than you would normally expect just looking at a single model having these aura abilities. In addition, I feel that it's important to mention that Szarekh is incredible at turning on the Code of Combat secondary objective. For those who don't know, Code of Combat is a Necron secondary objective that scores 3 victory points for each enemy unit that's destroyed by a noble. And something that's easily overlooked is that it doesn't require you to do that in the fight phase or anything. It's also noble units, not noble models. So Szarekh himself doesn't actually have to do the killing. He will score those points as long as his Mainier's Annihilator beams are blowing up tanks and stuff on the other side of the table. So even if you don't have that many noble keyworded units in your army, Szarekh himself can a lot of times score 12 or 15 victory points on this secondary alone, especially if your opponent has an army that's made up of a lot of small independent units that he can just laser beam to death from the other side of the table. So not only does he present an enormous threat in and of himself, he also force multiplies a large area of the table and gives you some army-wide abilities in terms of the command protocol control and his command points that he gives you, and turns on an entire secondary objective that he can score all by himself. Szarekh is like the quintessential jack of all trades. He just does it all. He punches, he inspires, he scores victory points. What a boss this dude is. So let's talk about a couple synergies that we have in the Necron Codex to use alongside Szarekh. Now I'm going to preface this by saying, like I mentioned at the top, Szarekh doesn't have a lot of synergies that work specifically well with him. A lot of the times he's operating independently and buffing the stuff around him. It pretty much goes without saying that any core unit, especially those with a high volume of attacks or shots, are good with Szarekh. He's good at buffing warriors. He's good at buffing tomb blades. He's good at buffing immortals. All that stuff is going to be made better because he can My Will Be Done them, Relentless March them, give them full rerolls, just wind them up and send them spinning across the table. That said, there are a couple stratagems that work with him specifically. I think it's also important to mention at this point that Dynastic Agent keyword, because it does something a little bit unexpected. Silent King is Szarekhon keyworded, which means in order to put him into a Necron's detachment, it has to be a Szarekhon detachment. However, Dynastic Agent keyworded units do not get sub-faction abilities. So despite the fact that the Silent King has an entire dynasty named after him, he doesn't get its abilities. That said, the detachment is still a Szarekhon detachment, which means you can still get access to the Szarekhon special stratagem, even though he himself doesn't actually get the sub-faction ability. He still has the correct keyword, and the detachment still has the correct keyword. He just doesn't get the wound reroll and the 5+ mortal wound ignore, which is too bad. He'd actually be really good at the 5+ mortal wound ignore, given that a 4+ invulnerable save, one of the best weapons to deal with it is smites and haywire and mortal wounds and stuff like that. Szarekh would really love to have that 5+ wound ignore, but no, it was not to be. However, that does mean that he can use Empiric Damping to deny a power within 18 inches on a 4+ to compound the Psychic Phase defense that he provides your army. Now, there are a couple other stratagems that are particularly good with him. I mentioned the Mainier's being incredibly reliable damage output, and the reason for that is the Techno-Oracular Targeting stratagem, which allows you to, once you've hit with a ranged attack, automatically wound. No wound roll required, which means if you need to punch 6 damage into something to kill it, you have 2 shots at rolling a 2+ from the 2 Mainir beams. If one of them hits, you spend that 1 CP, it automatically wounds. If it only has a 3+ save, it automatically takes 6 damage. There's one roll you need to make. It's a 2+ roll, and then for 1 CP, the rest just goes through and happens automatically. Phenomenal. That's so cool. That stratagem is excellent with those low volume, super high damage output attacks, and Szarekh comes packing 2 of those. Next up, the Stellar Alignment Protocol allows a vehicle to act at full wounds. Obviously, this is great, especially to ensure that Szarekh himself moves at his full speed and attacks with his full swath of attacks. Although, unfortunately, the stratagem only determines what profile you use. It does not actually give you those wounds back. So it doesn't reverse the preservative auto torpor ability, which says that his little side characters die once he's bracketed. It just changes his base characteristics, essentially. However, given that he's not a Titanic keyworded unit, which is kind of interesting, it also only costs 1 CP, so you win some, you lose some. Being a vehicle, he is also eligible to be automatically exploded with Curse of the Pharaon, which I think a lot of times you will want to do because that explosion is phenomenal, especially when it comes down to the late game and Szarekh has trundled across the table as far as he can and has embedded himself deep into the bowels of your opponent's army. Once they finally kill him and he auto-explodes for d6 mortal wounds on basically everything, it could be game over. Unfortunately, not being core keyworded and not being especially infantry means that a lot of the stratagems in the Necron Codex don't work with him, so that's about it for Synergies. For the same reason, not a lot of other units' abilities work on him. The one that I could find was the Technomancer. If you have a Szarekh Technomancer specifically with a Canoptic Cloak, you can heal him additional damage on top of his Living Metal, which means if he has a Technomancer tagging along with him, he's actually very resilient, and it's going to be very difficult to take that guy down over the course of 5 battle rounds. I know the Synergies section of this video isn't particularly well fleshed out, but I think that's part of the design of the unit. He's mostly a force multiplication tool rather than a recipient of buffs, so there's not a lot of stuff that synergize with Szarekh specifically, although, like I mentioned before, he buffs any core unit directly through the stratosphere that is anywhere near him. And with that, that brings us to the final portion of the video. The final verdict: is Szarekh worth taking in your army? And the answer is yes, absolutely. This guy's an absolute powerhouse. Now, he's not great for every single army. There are a lot of very efficient Necron builds, and not all of them are built around these core unit synergies that Szarekh makes really good. In addition, taking a quarter of your army and putting it into a single model that might not necessarily be in the particular dynasty, especially if you're playing with custom dynasties that the rest of your army is in, can be a little bit awkward. That said, if you have an army with a decent number of these core units that wants to pack into a ball around a big nuggety center and march up the table being buffed and delivering the judgment of the Silent King directly to your opponent's face with a big stick, I think Szarekh's going to be great for you. That's one of the benefits of Necrons, to be honest. The faction is super flexible and has a bunch of different archetypes that, while they may not be the most optimal, are very useful and, potentially tournament winning. And while I think Szarekh is an incredibly powerful unit and certainly one of the most powerful in the Codex, I like that he's also not an auto-include. Szarekh is basically exactly at the power level I'd like to see every unit in 40k. He's super good. He's super flashy. He does a bunch of stuff when he's on the table, but you don't have to take him. You can leave him alone if you want to. Although I think a lot of the most competitive Necron armies are going to either be built around the Silent King or around Catan Shards, essentially. It's one of those two things. So anyway, yeah, Silent King's sweet. And also, you're sweet for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks! This video wasn't a particularly silent one, so for that I apologize. But I do appreciate you watching to the end, and you know who else I appreciate? It's the patrons over at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. Also, the YouTube channel members. All those people are sweet, and they got some cool benefits like early access to this video, some unique videos, and other stuff. It's all great. It's all good stuff. If you want to join them, head on over to patreon.com/TacticalTortoise or click the join link down below the video, and you can help support the channel, help what I do, making all these videos, and also I love you forever. So thanks again for watching. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.